shortage. That makes it very hard to interfere with those energy movements, which makes it harder for us here to force the elites to give up some power to increase democratization. And that's essentially why they need to control where a lot of that oil is coming from, and at the same time to make sure that our economy here remains completely dependent on that oil and gas. As opposed to if you had not just any old renewables, because renewable, it's not that like as soon as you would switch to wind, everything would be wonderful and we'd have democracy. Of course not, because it comes down to who owns it, who controls it, and unless it's actually controlled by people, actually controlled by workers, and we've got ways of impacting and controlling that energy directly, we can't ensure democratization. But if you do have a system where a lot of the energy is controlled by us, much more locally, and we're not dependent ultimately, like who now do we rely on for energy? We rely on government and BP and Shell and the big six. That makes us dependent. That means we can't interfere, but we can't assert things. If on the other hand, they rely on us because we're generating it locally, we control it, and that's not a pipe dream. Like Denmark has lots of problems, but in Denmark, 70 or 80% of wind power, which provides an enormous portion of Denmark's wind, 70 to 80% of it is owned by individuals and co-ops, not by mega multinationals. It's possible to get somewhere like that. And as a result, it's much easier for people in Denmark to interfere and say, actually, we're going to change the politics here. Sorry, that was a bit of a theory roundabout. But that's why those human rights abuses and those wars, whether it's the massacres in Egypt or the war in Iraq, where they're crushing social movements and popular movements there, we need to be in solidarity with the people that are resisting that, and we need to stop those, but not just for the sake of human rights abuses there. We also need to stop them for the sake of us here, if we're going to have any chance of real democracy. Okay, that was my spiel. Does anyone else want to throw stuff? And it doesn't need to just be questions. I mean, some folks might have questions, but it can also like arguments or comments. Or...
I've got two questions. One is, have you read Greg Pallas' Vulture Picnic, and how reliable is that in terms of its allegations of the Caspian Sea, Deepwater Horizon, various allegations? The second is the impact of the dollar in all of this, because essentially it's the monopoly of oil trade in dollars which backs Saudi Arabia, backs the military across the region. So,
yep. Do other people want to say, because it might be good to have more kind of flow around rather than just from people to us, so we'll answer that.
Two.
But are there other questions or comments or thoughts as well? Yep.
I would have questions, Harry, to both of you. Over the current divestment campaigns, I wonder, I don't know, your opinions on that route or that tactic into shifting the balance of power away from oil.
You mean Palestine? No, he means climate divestment, I think.
Sorry, climate divestment, but also, and in the balances of power in terms of where we should attack, whether you think the power lies more within the large oil corporations or more seated in the government, or I'd be interested to know.
I guess I have one. If you say like the workers control it, I'm thinking of places like Nigeria where there's a division. Shell give some Nigerians elite kind of status and other Nigerians not, and then that causes a conflict and then there's war and blah blah. What would stop the workers in control of oil from becoming an elite group in
Do you want to go?
You go first.
with the microphones?
Yes. Okay. Pallas, I didn't read the book carefully, but I have talked to him about the Azerbaijan research. I think, so I'm trying to remember his details.
Well, basically,
Yeah.
in the Caspian Sea,
Yeah,
there was a similar blowout.
yeah.
That happened in
6 months
Deepwater
before
Horizon.
Deepwater Horizon.
It was in the months before,
Yeah.
exactly the same technology.
Yeah.
Luckily, nobody was killed,
Yeah.
and so it was covered up. So effectively, Deepwater Horizon was secondary degree murder or manslaughter on the basis that they had pre-knowledge that it was
Something
going to
like that.
blow.
Definitely. That's definitely the case. And actually there've been other cases in other places where there were similar things. And BP has a record. So Bob Dudley, not Bob Dudley, John Brown, who's now also head of the Tate, Lord Brown, also head of the Tate, sponsored by BP, getting all kinds of government positions. He was running BP for a long time, and part of his policy of BP was do what you were doing before, but do it for 90%, only spend 90% of the money that you were doing on it, but now do the same thing. But when you do that repeatedly, that means you cut and you cut and you cut and you cut. And obviously in any context you shouldn't cut and you cut and you cut and you cut. But if you're running some mega technology thing where you're drilling thousands of meters into the ground, and what you're doing is you're extracting highly combustible materials, and you cut and you cut and you cut, then you end up with that. And it's definitely, yeah, when you take those risks, that's what it is. Divestment. I think divestment's a very important tactic. I think, both in terms of Palestine and in terms of climate change, I think it's an essential tactic in withdrawing funds from centers of power, whether it's the Israelis or the oil companies, and cutting them off. I think that we make divestment in terms of climate change stronger if we say what we want the money to go to. And also if it's, because you can take two approaches to divestment. You can go to some mega pension fund asset manager in the City of London that are basically neoliberal bastards in like a massive tower and say, you know, investing in BP and Shell over the long run, not such a good idea. How about instead you take it out of the money and invest it in these mega wind projects that are taking land away from people and privatizing healthcare and, you know, private schools. Now, that might help us a bit in terms of climate change, a bit, but it doesn't get us to where we need to be in terms of shifting society and power, because that still leaves most of the power of the City of London with finance. However, a lot of those pension funds, that mega pension fund in the City of London are controlling, those are ours. Like, they don't belong to the City of London. They belong to Enfield Council or West Lancashire. And Enfield Council have a pension fund. Now, what they do is they hand it over to the City of London, who invest it into BP. Now, if instead Enfield Council say, wait a minute, how about we use our pension fund to build council housing and put solar panels here and set up a local energy company that we own with local residents, then that's also divestment. But it's taking back that investment and that finance. And that I think is totally transformative and also breaks down the power of London. And my thoughts on the worker-controlled, I think in Nigeria, Shell employ, like I know various people whose parents work, Nigerians whose parents work for Shell, and as a result, their kids managed to, you know, get scholarships, come here and go to nice schools and and became an elite. But those companies were either still private multinationals or the Nigerian state oil company, which was very top-down, very hierarchical and very corrupt. They weren't worker-run companies. I think if it's a worker-run entity that's actually democratic, then the default is that it will be allied with democratic forces. And, you know, ideally in a worker-run company, people would pay themselves more than they do at the moment, where they're getting completely exploited. So they might be a bit better off than the people who are still working in non-worker controlled companies who are being completely exploited. But that's start a shift in the economy from one thing to another thing. I'm not that concerned that worker-run entities would become new elites. There are questions in Norway. Statoil, which is a national oil company, far better than what we've got here by a long, long way. That did create a kind of elite technocratic set of corporate executives and employees. But that was because Statoil started off quite democratic and then became increasingly neoliberal. And it's always going to be a battle on reasserting democracy and power from below. Do you want to add on that bit?
Well, I just wanted to say something about the disinvestment thing. Sorry. Just on the disinvestment issue. I mean, clearly the whole disinvestment campaigns, you know, there's no doubt that they're very, very important, and they have been historically very, very important in all sorts of different contexts and campaigns. Partly, as much as anything, they raise awareness, you know. I mean, they're very, very useful in the sense of creating a debate in society and so on. But I just wanted to make one slightly more general point, which is I think it's very important that we don't fall for what is an ideological position by the globalisers, that today's world is just made up of kind of free flow of commodities and trade, and the corporations are running everything in a simplistic way. Because, you know, the corporations pay their taxes insofar as they do, or at least they give their support to state forces